A locked room, a lifeless body, and a single footprint on the ceiling. Welcome to Revenge Oath. I'm your moderator, Conan Doyle. Comment below, where are you watching from as we untangle this riddle? Your presence makes every case more thrilling. Thank you for being here. It was on a particularly dismal October morning that I found myself, once again, at 221B Baker Street, the hearth glowing dimly against the grey fog, pressing itself insistently against the window panes. London, in all its smoky sprawl, seemed to hold its breath beneath a pall of drizzle. Holmes, of course, was unmoved by the oppressive weather. He stood by the fireplace, eyes half-lidded, fingers steepled beneath his chin, deep in one of those meditative trances I had come to associate with the onset of a most unusual case. I had just set down a copy of The Times, which offered little beyond mundane reports of dockworker strikes and political tedium, when Holmes stirred. "Watson," he said quietly, without so much as glancing at me, "the man approaching our doorstep is neither a policeman nor a member of the landed gentry, though he carries with him the burdens of both." I raised an eyebrow. "You've heard his step?" "Indeed. Heavy, decisive, but not confident. A man with authority but no comfort in it. My dear fellow, one must learn to listen to a footstep as if it were a voice." He was about to expand on this when a firm knock echoed through the flat. Mrs. Hudson's silhouette passed the frosted glass briefly, and a moment later she ushered in a tall, rain-spattered man in a long wool coat and constable's cap. "Inspector Gregson, sir," she announced, with no small amount of curiosity in her tone. "Gregson," I exclaimed, rising to shake the inspector's hand. "What brings you out on a morning like this?" The inspector, who had always struck me as one of the more capable men at Scotland Yard, if occasionally plodding, wasted no time with pleasantries. He removed his cap, revealing a mop of wet blonde hair, and sat forward on the edge of the armchair Holmes gestured to. "Mr. Holmes," he said gravely, "we've a situation in Southwark. Dalrymple Street. A housekeeper by the name of Mrs. Edna Rigg was found this morning. Dead, locked from the inside, doors barred, windows latched. No sign of a struggle. But there's one thing that has every man on the case scratching his head." Holmes arched an eyebrow. "Do go on." Gregson leaned forward, lowering his voice as if the very room might betray him. "There's a footprint on the ceiling above the body." I admit I laughed aloud at the absurdity of it. "Surely you don't mean—" "A bare footprint, Dr. Watson," Gregson interrupted. "Upturned, as though the person had been walking on the ceiling. A single impression, heel and all, and no others to speak of." Even Holmes's fingers twitched at that. He stood and strode to the window, as if the fog might provide answers. "The room was sealed, you say?" "Absolutely. The constable on the scene had to break in, not a single lock disturbed from the outside." Holmes turned, and I could already see the gleam in his eye, the cold fire that only the most confounding of mysteries could ignite. "Southwark, you said? Fetch your coat, Watson. We are overdue for a walk in the rain." Gregson hesitated. "I must warn you, it's not just the footprint. The entire room has something unwholesome about it. The men are uneasy. They say it's cursed." Holmes allowed himself a half smile. "Then let us be cursed together, Inspector. But first you will tell me, did the deceased wear a ring?" Gregson blinked. "Yes, a gold band, worn down thin." "How? Left hand?" "Yes, but I—" Holmes waved him off. "We shall speak no more until I see the scene. Come, Watson. I believe we are on the cusp of something delightfully irregular." And with that, Holmes swept his Inverness over his shoulders, and we plunged into the gloom of the London streets, toward the house on Dalrymple Street, and the impossible footprint that would defy every natural law we knew. The rain was relentless as we arrived at Dalrymple Street, a quiet, narrow lane tucked between the brick shoulders of Southwark's older buildings. The house in question stood at number 13, a narrow, three-story Georgian dwelling that looked no more remarkable than its neighbors, except perhaps for the small crowd of curious onlookers gathered under dripping umbrellas just beyond the police cordon. Holmes barely acknowledged them. With his collar turned up and eyes scanning the upper windows, he moved with deliberate purpose. Gregson led us up the steps and through the front door, which opened onto a narrow hall lit by gaslight, the faintest trace of camphor and furniture polish, mingling with something more metallic. Blood, I realized, though faintly so. She was found this morning by the charwoman, Agnes Bell, Gregson explained, lowering his voice out of habit. Said she couldn't get the front door open and went around through the garden entrance. Found the back door locked too. Police forced entry after that. Where is Miss Bell now? Holmes asked, without slowing. In the kitchen, being kept warm. I told her you might want to speak with her. Later, Holmes said. Take me to the room. We mounted the stairs, our footsteps muffled on the worn carpet. Gregson led us to the first-floor parlor, now eerily silent. A constable stood by the door, clearly uncomfortable, and gave a respectful nod to Holmes and myself. She's inside, Gregson murmured, pushing open the door. The parlor was a modest, well-kept room with heavy drapes drawn tightly against the daylight. A coal fire had died in the grate, casting a pall of cold into the space. In the center of the floor, between a faded Persian rug and an overturned sewing basket, lay the body of Edna Rigg. She appeared to have collapsed where she stood. Her body was sprawled awkwardly, one hand curled inward, the other extended as if reaching for something. Her face bore no expression of violence or pain, simply the slack calm of the recently deceased. She was perhaps 60, dressed plainly in a black skirt and cream blouse, with a grey bun still pinned neatly in place. Holmes stepped around her with a respectful lightness, eyes flickering over the details. No visible wounds, he murmured. No broken furniture. Nothing appears disturbed, except the needlework. He stooped, examining the spilled contents of the sewing basket. 3 threads snipped cleanly. Cotton, red, blue. A 4th, grey wool, cut unevenly. He glanced at the ceiling. And there, he said simply. I followed his gaze and saw it. A single bare footprint, inverted, pressed with uncanny clarity into the white plaster just above where the woman had fallen. I felt a shiver climb my spine, not from fear, but from the absurdity of it. The print was unmistakable. 5 toes, the ball of the foot, the heel. No distortion, no smudging. Holmes retrieved his magnifying glass and examined the print. No soot, no debris. The surface is undisturbed, yet the print is firm. Remarkable. Gregson scratched the back of his neck. None of the men can make sense of it. We've checked for access points above and below. Nothing. Precisely what I expected, Holmes replied. He moved to the wall and studied the plaster surface. What do we know of Mrs. Rigg? Gregson consulted a small notebook. Widowed 10 years. Worked as a housekeeper here for the past 5. The tenant, Mr. Leonard Gryce, is away on business. She was trusted, discreet, dependable by all accounts. Lived in the attic room. The only other regular visitor was the charwoman, Bell, who comes 3 times a week. Holmes moved to the fireplace and picked up a poker. He tapped it gently against the tiles, then knelt and reached behind the grate. Ah, he said softly. Watson, observe. He withdrew a small object, holding it out to me on his handkerchief. It was a twisted bit of charred metal, too small to determine its original form, but recently burned. What do you make of it? I asked. Hard to say, but it was deliberately placed where it would be destroyed, and not part of the house's fittings, I would wager. At that moment, Holmes turned abruptly and walked to the door. The attic, he said. I would like to see where she lived. Gregson led us up a narrow staircase. The attic room was small and spare, a narrow bed, a writing desk, a wash basin, and a trunk at the foot of the bed. The room smelled faintly of lavender and starch. Holmes moved like a ghost, disturbing nothing, only looking. The desk contained a few personal items, a modest prayer book, several neatly folded letters tied with ribbon, and a half-completed crossword. Holmes paused, scanning it. "This clue," he murmured. 7 letters. An elevated deception. He tapped the nearly completed word. "Ceiling," she wrote. He raised his eyebrows at that. A mind still sharp, it seems. An irony, even at the end. Then he opened the trunk. Inside were clothes folded with care, a small box of keepsakes, and a single book laid on top. A volume of Shakespeare's The Tempest. Holmes opened it. Inside the front cover, written in a careful, unfamiliar hand, to E.R., whose silence makes music of my days, L.G. "Leonard Gryce?" I asked. "I should think so," Holmes replied, "and something more than employment connected them, perhaps affection, even if only one-sided." Holmes stood. "We shall speak with Miss Bell now." Back downstairs, the charwoman sat in the kitchen, holding a cup of tea in trembling hands. She was a stout woman in her 40s, her eyes red-rimmed but alert. Gregson made introductions, and Holmes seated himself opposite her. "Miss Bell, may I ask, was anything out of place when you arrived this morning?" "No, sir. All just as it should be. Except, well, yes? I heard something last week, when I came in early on Wednesday. Footsteps, above me. But there's no floor above the attic, sir. Just rafters and roof." Holmes exchanged a glance with me. "And you told no one?" "I thought I imagined it, and I didn't want to cause a fuss. Mrs. Rigg didn't believe in foolishness. Noises, a footprint on the ceiling, something burned in the grate." Holmes stood abruptly. "Gregson, I'll need a carpenter, one familiar with this area's houses, someone discreet. There's something hidden in this house. I believe Mrs. Rigg found it, and it killed her." "But how?" I asked, glancing back toward the parlor. "There's no wound, no trauma, no poison in plain sight." Holmes picked up his coat. "That, my dear Watson, is the question that has yet to walk upright. For now, let us examine the roof. I suspect the solution is overhead, just not where one might expect." We climbed once more, this time through the attic's narrow crawl space, and out onto the cold slate of the roof, the rain tapering off as clouds reluctantly parted. Holmes moved carefully along the ridge, then stopped, crouched beside a small ventilation pipe near the chimney. He tapped it, then looked inside. "Recently disturbed," he murmured. "Watson, fetch a light." I did as asked. Holmes lowered a lantern into the pipe, then drew it back and nodded grimly. "There is ash inside, fine, like incense, or powdered root. Something burned recently, drawn upward through here." He straightened. "A message, Watson. One Mrs. Rigg saw, and someone else wished to conceal. A secret written in smoke, and footprints that should not exist." I stared at him. "Holmes, what are we dealing with?" He gave me a rare smile, one both amused and dangerous. "An illusion, Watson, a deception of the most theatrical kind, and like all stagecraft, it relies upon the audience not knowing where to look." We returned below, but the house felt different now. Not cursed, not haunted, but filled with intention. Holmes said nothing more that afternoon, but I knew the case had turned. The answer hovered just out of reach, and Holmes was circling it now, drawing closer with every step. That evening found us once more in the drawing room at 221B Baker Street, though Holmes had scarcely touched the tea Mrs. Hudson brought in, nor had he spoken a word since our return. He was seated in his armchair, with his long legs stretched toward the fire, his hands steepled beneath his chin, eyes half closed. It was the familiar posture of deep calculation, attention strung taut, not with emotion, but with deliberate thought. I, on the other hand, was restless. The image of that footprint, so perfectly formed, yet so entirely out of place, had settled uncomfortably in my mind. I paced the room, occasionally glancing at Holmes, hoping for some utterance that might clarify the shape of the enigma we were unraveling. Finally, Holmes stirred. "Watson, what do you make of the ventilation shaft on the roof?" I considered it carefully. It had been recently disturbed, ash within, as you said, and positioned above the parlor, directly over the footprint. Holmes nodded. Quite so. And yet, curiously, no sign of any entry through the roof itself. The shaft is far too narrow for a person. Therefore, the footprint did not arrive by way of the roof. Which means, I said slowly, it must have been created from within the parlor. But how? There were no signs of anything used to reach the ceiling. No ladder, no scaffolding, and certainly no person tall enough to place it there unaided. Holmes gave a soft hum of satisfaction. Precisely. We must allow for a method of vertical deception. An illusion, as I said. Now recall the placement of the body. Where did she fall? Directly beneath the footprint. And her arm? Outstretched, as though reaching toward the ceiling. He opened his eyes then, glancing toward me with that quick glint of triumph that always preceded a revelation. "She saw it, Watson. The footprint. She died staring at it. That is no coincidence. It was meant for her." I paused. "You believe the footprint was placed deliberately for Mrs. Rigg to discover?" "Undoubtedly. But the footprint itself is not the murder weapon. It is the trigger, the fuse to a far subtler device." My brow furrowed. "You mean she was frightened to death?" "Not quite, but close." Holmes stood now, moving to his chemical bench and selecting a small vial from among the clutter. He held it up to the gaslight. "You recall the ash in the pipe?" "Yes. Powder fine. You thought it might be incense. Or something similar. There are substances which, when burned, release compounds that can induce paralysis, hallucination, or, in the case of certain sensitive individuals, cardiac failure, particularly in combination with emotional shock." I stared at the vial. "You're suggesting Mrs. Rigg was poisoned? Through the air?" "Indeed. A carefully orchestrated scenario. A room sealed to ensure accumulation, a visual shock designed to prime the nervous system, and a symbolic image, a footprint, upside down, to induce existential dread." He held up a second object, the charred scrap from the fireplace. "This may have contained the compound. If the pipe above the room allowed the smoke to descend through a subtle channel, the room would have filled with the vapor undetected, and she would never have understood what was happening." I felt a chill. Then the killer must have access to the attic, or at least to the roof. Holmes gave a satisfied nod, which leads us at last to Mr. Leonard Gryce. We visited Scotland Yard the following morning to examine the background of the absent tenant. Holmes spent nearly an hour reviewing documents, letters and correspondences, while I spoke briefly with a clerk who confirmed Gryce had left the country nearly 2 weeks prior for an extended business trip to Brussels. "Too early," I muttered to Holmes. "If he is away, how could he have orchestrated the murder?" "Unless," Holmes replied, "he never left at all." That afternoon, we returned to Dalrymple Street with Inspector Gregson and a locksmith in tow. Holmes had requested access to the attic storage beyond Mrs. Rigg's quarters, an area reportedly unused and long locked. The locksmith made quick work of the heavy iron padlock securing the narrow door, and we stepped into the dark, musty space beyond. The air was stale, and the only light filtered in through a grime-coated gable window. Dust lay thick on most surfaces, except one. A narrow workbench near the center showed signs of recent use. Holmes ran a finger across it and held it up. Clean, very clean. He crouched beside the bench and drew back a canvas drape. Beneath it lay a small wooden box, simple in construction, but with fine joints and brass clasps. Inside were fragments of burnt paper, the faint scent of something earthy and acrid, and a small empty vial with a paper label. The writing had faded, but a few letters were legible. Aureum of aromatic comp. Holmes held the vial beneath his nose and nodded. Bitter almond, traces of hellebore, and perhaps aconite. Combined, a potent agent for nervous disruption. Delivered via smoke, I'd wager. I knelt beside him. So he built the apparatus here. But who used it? Not Grice if he's abroad. That remains to be determined. We must speak with someone who knew both the deceased and Grice. Someone who might bridge the gap between them. Holmes turned to Gregson. Is the charwoman still available? She's at her sister's now, but I can have her brought in. Holmes shook his head. No need. Let us visit her instead. People speak more freely in familiar surroundings. An hour later, we found ourselves in a cramped cottage on Canning Cross Road. Agnes Bell received us with some suspicion, but warmed quickly under Holmes's careful questioning. Tell me, Miss Bell, he said gently. Had Mrs. Rigg any recent quarrels? Any tension between her and Mr. Grice? She hesitated. No, not a quarrel, but she'd been troubled. She told me something wasn't right, said she'd found something upstairs, in the attic. What sort of something? She wouldn't say, only that it wasn't hers, and it wasn't supposed to be there. I thought maybe a rat, or one of the neighbors sneaking about, but she looked pale and scared. Holmes leaned forward slightly. Did she ever speak of Mr. Grice in personal terms? Agnes frowned. She used to admire him, I think, but lately she spoke less, said he'd changed, that he was obsessed with proof of something. I didn't understand her. She said he believed there was a truth hidden above the eye line. Holmes's eyes gleamed. Thank you, Miss Bell. That's more helpful than you know. Back at Baker Street that night, Holmes lit his pipe and spoke aloud as he thought. An obsession with hidden things, with reversing expectations. A message burned, destroyed before it could be read. A footprint placed above the line of natural vision. This is a theater of inversion, Watson. The killer wants us looking the wrong way. But who? I asked. Grice, if he's away, or someone using his absence? Holmes did not respond immediately. He stepped to the window and stared into the darkness. Someone with access. Someone who knew both Rigg and Grice. Someone who feared a truth being uncovered. We must return to the attic tomorrow. I suspect the footprint was only the beginning. He turned to me, eyes sharp now. We are close, Watson. Very close. But the killer has staged a very clever illusion, and like any magician, he's counting on our failure to look behind the curtain. In the silence that followed, I felt the weight of the case press in anew, not just for its strangeness, but for the deliberate intellect behind it. Someone had turned fear into a weapon, and Holmes, ever the scientist of the soul, would not rest until he dismantled that device, piece by logical piece. The following morning dawned bleak and grey, as though London itself had taken a breath and held it in quiet anticipation. Holmes was already dressed when I came down to breakfast, his boots polished, his coat draped over the back of a chair, and a half-filled notebook lying open on the breakfast table. Your housekeeper died trying to protect you, but you're alive, and the truth matters more than the hiding now. Leonard Grice sighed and turned away. He told me I was finished, that he'd see to it I vanished quietly, so I let him. I let him arrange the trip. I even signed the paperwork. Edna helped me disappear before the worst came. You trusted him, I said gently. I did. Too long, I fear. He sat heavily on a narrow bench. He said I'd damaged the family, that I was sentimental, that I put loyalty before profit. I didn't care. I wanted Edna to have what she deserved. My father would have seen to her. But Percival, he saw scandal in her loyalty. And so you went into hiding, Holmes said, glancing around the cottage. But when Edna discovered the strongbox, I told her to keep it hidden. Said it would keep her safe. I didn't know how far he would go. Holmes' expression hardened. You should have. You knew your brother better than anyone. Leonard dropped his gaze. I was a coward. No, Holmes said. You were cornered. He turned to me. Watson, would you mind fetching Gregson? I believe his office is still lit. We shall need a full statement from Mr. Gryce before morning. I went at once, though I admit I paused at the door, casting a final glance at the ruined man now seated in the half-light of his own survival. His grief was real, his silence damning. By the time I returned with Gregson, Holmes had begun his patient extraction of the timeline, the forged documents, the betrayal, the moment Edna Rigg understood what she had stumbled upon, and her decision not to run, but to act. She warned him, Leonard confessed. She said she'd go to the papers if he didn't stop. Said she had the records and my letter. I never knew where she kept them. She hid them under the very floor where she died, Holmes said quietly. She never gave in. The inspector nodded grimly and began his formalities, though I could see in his eyes the rare glint of admiration that often followed Holmes' revelations. This case, strange as it was, had never relied on chance or coincidence. Every move had been methodical, every clue placed not for drama, but as a trap for reason to uncover. Holmes and I returned to Baker Street just before dawn. The city was still sleeping, wrapped in mist and soot, the gas lamps flickering against the first blush of morning. As Holmes shrugged off his coat, I could not help but speak the thought that had been forming all night. Holmes, I said slowly, do you think she knew what was coming? Mrs. Rigg, do you think she understood the danger? Holmes moved to the fire, poked it back to life with a few brisk jabs, and stared into the growing flame. She knew someone would come, he said. She may not have anticipated how or when, but she had already decided what must be done. Stocks. My brother manipulated the will, and your role in the household has always been more than they wanted to admit. I fear what will happen if you speak of it, but I cannot let the truth rot in silence. If anything happens to me, let this be your weapon. Let the world know what they did. I have included the deed, the investment records, and the transfer ledgers. You will see the theft in full. Forgive me for being weak. I never had your courage. Yours, always, L.G. I looked up at Holmes. So Gryce wasn't abroad. He was in hiding. Or rather, he expected to disappear. Holmes shook his head. No, Watson. This letter wasn't written yesterday. Look at the paper, discolored at the edges. Ink slightly faded. This was written months ago, perhaps longer. And if I'm not mistaken, he extracted a second letter, older, unsigned, and smudged with fingerprints. She knows. The old woman. She found the files. You must act quickly before she speaks to anyone. If you cannot be trusted to do it, I shall intervene myself. We cannot afford scandal now. Not with the investors watching. Holmes nodded grimly. This is the voice behind the curtain. Not Gryce, but someone else. Someone with access. Someone who feared Edna Rigg's loyalty and her silence. Then we have two players, I said. Gryce, the victim of a broader scheme, and someone else. Someone who killed to protect the lie. Holmes rose. We must discover who else had access to this house, Watson. Beyond Gryce and Mrs. Rigg. The key lies in the circle around the inheritance. He instructed Gregson to secure the strongbox and have the documents analyzed. Then we set out to trace the Gryce family. Leonard Gryce, we soon discovered, had a brother, Percival Gryce, a solicitor of modest repute with offices near Chancery Lane. A bachelor, childless, and said to be meticulous in his affairs, Percival had managed the family's holdings after the death of their father. We visited the firm that same afternoon. The clerk, nervous under Holmes's direct gaze, admitted that Percival had taken sudden leave a fortnight ago, citing a private illness. No forwarding address was provided. Holmes asked a few gentle questions about recent estate dealings and whether any financial irregularities had arisen. The clerk hesitated, then said, "There was a recent transaction. Mr. Gryce arranged to transfer several properties into a private holding company. Gryce and Blount consolidated, but the paperwork was odd, backdated, and signed only by him." Holmes's expression darkened. Forgery and panic. As we stepped out into the fog of Chancery Lane, Holmes lit a cigarette and stared into the street. "Percival is our man," he said. "He feared exposure and struck first, but he lacked the cold blood to confront Mrs. Rigg directly. Instead, he staged a scene designed to terrify, to paralyze. And the footprint. A symbol. An impossible sign meant to daze and confuse, but also a message. Look up, it says. But in truth, the answers were always below." He paused. "Now we need only draw Percival Gryce into the open, and for that, we must give him what he fears most." "Exposure," I said. "Precisely." Holmes sent telegrams that evening to Gregson, to 2 editors, and finally to a barrister. He dictated a brief but damning summary of the discovered documents and instructed that a fictitious, anonymous tip had placed them in police hands. Within hours, the whispers would begin. We did not have to wait long. At 11:30 that night, a figure approached 221B Baker Street. A man in a dark overcoat, collar turned up, hat pulled low. He knocked once, softly, and Holmes, already watching from the shadows by the window, opened the door himself. Percival Gryce stepped in, his face pale, his hands gloved, and his eyes frantic. I know what you've heard," he stammered, "but you've been misled. My brother, he's not innocent." Holmes said nothing, only gestured for him to sit. "I need to know what the police have, what's been found. I can explain everything." Holmes raised a hand. "No need, Mr. Gryce. We already know the truth. You constructed the device in the attic. You burned the compound that killed Mrs. Rigg. You forged documents and framed your own brother." Gryce's lips parted, but no sound came. "You underestimated her," Holmes continued coldly. "She was loyal. She refused your bribe. She found the documents and hid them, and for that, you devised a method to make her death seem supernatural. A footprint on the ceiling, a locked room, a mind-destroying vision." Gryce trembled. She would have ruined everything. You don't understand. The estate, my entire firm would have collapsed." "Better a collapsed firm than a murdered woman," Holmes said sharply. Gregson emerged from the adjoining room with 2 constables. Gryce turned, panic rising in his throat, but there was nowhere left to flee. He sagged in the chair as the constables moved forward. As they took him into custody, Holmes only said, "When you build an illusion, Mr. Gryce, you must be certain there are no mirrors left uncovered." And then, as the door closed behind them, and the rain tapped softly on the glass, Holmes returned to his chair and lit his pipe, the fire reflecting dimly in his eyes. "There are no ghosts in London, Watson," he said quietly. "Only men like Gryce, who prey on fear and expect it to carry them into silence." The fire had burned low in the hearth by the time the constables led Percival Gryce away into the wet London night, leaving behind only the faint scent of damp wool and desperation. Holmes did not rise from his chair. Instead, he sat quietly, his fingers drumming the armrest, his gaze fixed somewhere beyond the edge of the room, as if listening not to the silence, but to the echo of the case still unfolding in his mind. I remained opposite him, notebook in hand, attempting to sketch a rough outline of events. Yet something itched at me, a question I hadn't the nerve to voice just yet. Holmes, as ever, anticipated it before I could speak. "You are wondering if it is finished, Watson," he said, without turning his head. "I am," I admitted. "We have the strongbox, the letters, the confession in all but name. And yet—" Holmes gave a dry chuckle. "And yet, you're unsettled. Good. So am I. Because one final question remains unanswered, and that question is Leonard Gryce. I sat forward. You believe he's still alive? I believe the absence of his body is the loudest testimony in this entire affair, and no man vanishes so completely without help or purpose. Then you suspect Percival concealed him? Holmes leaned forward and opened the drawer of his writing desk, withdrawing the original letter from Leonard to Edna Rigg. He placed it on the table between us. This letter was never posted, Watson. It was hidden in the box beneath the floorboards. Why? If Leonard intended Edna to use it after his death, why not send it? Why risk her never discovering it? I frowned, rereading the neat, sorrowful lines. Then you believe she did receive it, that she knew of its contents before his disappearance? She did more than know, Holmes said. She helped him. He stood abruptly and paced to the window. She found something. Agnes Bell said as much, and the letter all but confirms it. But Leonard, I now suspect, did not vanish. He was hidden, Watson. Hidden in plain sight. I blinked. Where? Holmes turned slowly, a smile playing at the corner of his mouth. Not where, Watson. When. We are late. I had long learned to abandon further questioning once Holmes took on that particular tone. Within the hour, we found ourselves once more in Southwark, trudging through narrow alleyways slick with evening drizzle. Holmes moved quickly, pausing only once to verify an address in his notebook, then finally stopping at the edge of a row of cottages behind Dalrymple Street. Tenants' housing for servants and tradesmen, unremarkable, save for one detail. This one, Holmes said, knocking on the door of the last cottage. Number 15A. According to housing records, it's rented under the name Louis Grant, initials LG. The door creaked open slowly, revealing an elderly man with a stooped posture, spectacles perched on his nose, and an unkempt beard. He looked at Holmes and then at me, and his expression faltered. Holmes stepped inside without invitation. "Good evening, Mr. Gryce." The man's lips trembled. You've made a mistake." "I rarely do," Holmes replied, removing his hat. "Though I imagine you had good reasons. Your brother intended to ruin you. Your housekeeper died trying to protect you. But you're alive, and the truth matters more than the hiding now." Leonard Gryce sighed and turned away. He told me I was finished, that he'd see to it I vanished quietly. So I let him. I let him arrange the trip. I even signed the paperwork. Edna helped me disappear before the worst came. "You trusted him," I said gently. "I did. Too long, I fear." He sat heavily on a narrow bench. He said I'd damaged the family, that I was sentimental, that I put loyalty before profit. I didn't care. I wanted Edna to have what she deserved. My father would have seen to her. But Percival, he saw scandal in her loyalty. "And so you went into hiding," Holmes said, glancing around the cottage. "But when Edna discovered the strongbox, I told her to keep it hidden. Said it would keep her safe. I didn't know how far he would go." Holmes' expression hardened. "You should have. You knew your brother better than anyone." Leonard dropped his gaze. "I was a coward." "No," Holmes said. "You were cornered." He turned to me. "Watson, would you mind fetching Gregson? I believe his office is still lit. We shall need a full statement from Mr. Gryce before morning." I went at once, though I admit I paused at the door, casting a final glance at the ruined man now seated in the half-light of his own survival. His grief was real, his silence damning. By the time I returned with Gregson, Holmes had begun his patient extraction of the timeline, the forged documents, the betrayal, the moment Edna Rigg understood what she had stumbled upon, and her decision not to run, but to act. "She warned him," Leonard confessed. "She said she'd go to the papers if he didn't stop. Said she had the records and my letter. I never knew where she kept them. She hid them under the very floor where she died," Holmes said quietly. "She never gave in." The inspector nodded grimly and began his formalities. though I could see in his eyes the rare glint of admiration that often followed Holmes' revelations. This case, strange as it was, had never relied on chance or coincidence. Every move had been methodical, every clue placed not for drama, but as a trap for reason to uncover. Holmes and I returned to Baker Street just before dawn. The city was still sleeping, wrapped in mist and soot, the gas lamps flickering against the first blush of morning. As Holmes shrugged off his coat, I could not help but speak the thought that had been forming all night. "Holmes," I said slowly, "do you think she knew what was coming? Mrs. Rigg, do you think she understood the danger?" Holmes moved to the fire, poked it back to life with a few brisk jabs, and stared into the growing flame. "She knew someone would come," he said. "She may not have anticipated how or when, but she had already decided what must be done." He turned to me with a rare softness in his eyes. "Courage, Watson, wears many faces. In her case, it wore an apron and carried a needle, but it stood firm." I nodded, words failing me. After a long pause, Holmes added, almost to himself, "She left no legacy save a footprint on the ceiling." And yet it was enough. We sat in silence, each in his own thoughts, while the city slowly awoke beyond our windows, unaware that a murder had been solved not by the ghosts some imagined, but by the steady hand of deduction and the enduring loyalty of a woman who refused to be frightened into silence. The sun had only just begun to bleed through the city's soot-smeared skyline when I awoke the following morning to find Holmes already at the breakfast table, immaculately dressed and leafing through the morning edition of the Times. His teacup sat untouched, though the scent of strong Assam hung in the air like a patient invitation. "Anything?" I asked as I joined him, rubbing the sleep from my eyes. He handed me the paper without looking up. "Page 4, small column near the bottom." I scanned the page and found it, no headline, just a brief notice. Legal proceedings were initiated late last night in the matter of the Grice estate. Percival Grice has been taken into custody under suspicion of forgery and conspiracy. Inspector Tobias Gregson of Scotland Yard confirmed that inquiries remain ongoing. No further comment at this time. "That's all?" I said, disappointed. Holmes nodded. "Exactly as it should be. The quiet exposure of the truly guilty is the only proper conclusion. There is no need to parade a corpse of a reputation through the streets, even if the man behind it has done worse in silence." I nodded slowly, but something still gnawed at me. "You said yesterday that the case wasn't entirely finished, even after Mr. Leonard Grice came forward." Holmes set the paper down, his fingertips steepled once more. "Indeed, there remains the matter of the delivery." "The delivery?" "The footprint, Watson," he said softly. "The mechanism by which it appeared. A single inverted print placed on the ceiling, perfectly formed, with no smudge, no second print, no error. Whoever placed it did so with precision. That is no accident. It's a message, yes, but also a signature." I paused, startled by the renewed conviction in his voice. "You believe someone else was involved? That Percival Grice didn't act alone?" "Precisely. Forgery and bribery. Yes, Percival was more than capable, and he had motive in abundance. But the construction of that room, the dispersion of poison through a disguised ventilation system, the theatrical footprint, it all smacks of someone else's hand, someone practiced in illusion, someone methodical." Holmes stood, fetched his coat from the rack, and turned to me with an expectant look. "We're not done, Watson. We must return to Dalrymple Street. There's one more scene left to play out." Though I had thought myself ready to close the chapter, I followed without argument. Holmes' instincts rarely led us astray, and I had learned by now not to question the sharp edge of his unease. The constable on duty allowed us entrance with a curious glance, but Holmes waved off questions with his usual authority and a final point of clarification. The house stood quiet, cold, the air stale with the absence of its inhabitants. Holmes led me not to the parlor this time, nor to the attic, but to the narrow basement stairs that wound beneath the kitchen. We descended carefully, our footsteps muffled on stone. The basement was spare, bare brick walls, shelves stacked with long unused preserves, and a central work table covered with dust. A coal scuttle lay untouched in the corner. Holmes moved with care, examining each shelf until his hand froze upon a small wooden box pushed deep into the shadows. He brought it out, placed it on the table, and opened the lid. Inside was a tightly coiled rope, several glass vials filled with powders, and a pair of what I first mistook for gloves. But upon closer inspection were thin-soled slippers, each one cut perfectly to resemble a human foot, barefoot and with soft ridges carved into the soles. Holmes held one up delicately. "There's your footprint, Watson." I stared. "You mean someone pressed this to the ceiling? But how?" He reached beneath the table and pointed to two discreet anchor hooks screwed into the joists. "These were for the pulley system. Someone affixed the rope here, looped through the floorboards of the parlor, most likely during a time when Mrs. Rigg was out, and used the pulley to hoist themselves or an extended device upward. With that shoe affixed to a pole, say, the footprint could be imprinted without ever leaving the floor." "Ingenious," I whispered. "Indeed. Too ingenious for Percival." Holmes turned the shoe over in his hands, then picked up one of the files. He popped the stopper and held it to his nose. "Aconitum, again. The same poison we traced through the ventilation ash, but here in pure powder form. This was the preparation area, a laboratory of sorts." He stood still for a moment, then turned to me sharply. "We must find the tenant who lives 2 doors down, number 17 Dalrymple Street. His name is Ridley. He is an amateur magician." I blinked. A magician? Holmes smiled thinly. "He performed at charity events last winter. I recall his name from a pamphlet. He is known for sleight of hand and mechanical rigging. He is also, incidentally, the only resident with access to both the rooftops and the cellar roots behind the Grice property, and he owed Percival a substantial debt, something I confirmed through banking records earlier this morning." We returned upstairs and sent for Gregson at once, who arrived 30 minutes later with 2 plainclothes men. Holmes relayed his theory quickly. Ridley, employed by Percival Grice, had been paid, or coerced, to construct the illusion. He built the pulley, crafted the false footprint device, prepared the toxin, and ensured its delivery at the precise moment Edna Rigg would be alone in the parlor. When the inspector asked why Ridley hadn't simply been used for the entire murder, Holmes replied coolly, "Because Ridley is a coward. A clever coward, but a coward nonetheless. He would never strike the final blow. That was Percival's role, to ensure Mrs. Rigg was in the room at the correct hour and to lock the doors from behind under some pretense. The magician supplied the theater. The lawyer supplied the motive. By afternoon, Ridley had been taken into custody. His protests were loud, but his fear was louder. Within 2 hours of interrogation, he had confessed, not to murder, but to arrangement. He described how he had been promised payment to install the device in the attic, how Percival had insisted on the precise placement of the footprint, and how he had followed instructions without knowing the full result. It was enough. Gregson, though grim, allowed himself a small nod of approval. "A theatrical trick to cover a very real crime," he muttered. "You were right, Mr. Holmes." Again. Back at Baker Street, as the fog deepened and the gas lights blinked against the encroaching evening, Holmes stood once more at the window. "They almost got away with it, Watson," he said quietly. "A man and his tool, one to pull the strings, the other to cast the shadows." He turned to me. "But illusion has its limits, and a footprint on the ceiling, however dramatic, cannot hold up under the weight of logic." I smiled. "Nor under the gaze of Sherlock Holmes." Holmes gave a brief laugh, then settled into his armchair once more. Let the world believe in ghosts, Watson. It gives us a distinct advantage. And with that, he lit his pipe and let the silence of the evening swallow the last echoes of the mystery, a mystery born of deception, shaped by smoke and unraveled by reason. The following morning broke with a wind sharp enough to shake the panes of 221B Baker Street, rattling the window in short, fretful bursts, as if the city itself were attempting to speak a final word on the matter. Holmes, however, was not to be stirred by mere weather. He sat cross-legged on the rug before the fireplace, his violin resting upon his lap, his expression as composed as a man solving a chess problem he had already won. I, on the other hand, could not dismiss the case so easily. I kept returning in my mind to the image of Ridley, the illusionist, the technician of crime, breaking down in the yard, tears slipping past his spectacles as he confessed to his carefully detached involvement. "I never touched her," he had said. "I never meant for her to die." Yet it was all designed to kill. The smoke, the footprint, the sealed room, a perfect death by suggestion. "Holmes," I said at last, setting down my teacup, "I find myself troubled still." Holmes plucked a soft harmonic from the G string of his violin. "Good. That means your instincts remain intact. What troubles you?" "Everything fits now, yes. Percival's motive, Ridley's devices, but it still feels—" I hesitated, trying to name the unease. Too orchestrated. Ridley claimed he was given instructions. Very specific instructions. But you believe Percival conceived of it all himself. Holmes tilted his head. The violin bow paused in mid-air. "No, Watson, I do not." I sat up straighter. Then someone else was behind it? He rose and laid the violin gently on the settee. I have wondered from the start whether Percival Gryce, calculating though he was, possessed the imagination for such symbolic violence. It is one thing to steal from your brother, to defraud an estate. But it is another to imagine a psychological death, one designed to mimic a haunting. The footprint, the sealed chamber, the suggestion of the supernatural. These are the instruments of one who understands fear not merely as a consequence, but as a tool. Holmes reached for his notebook, flipped it open, and read a few lines under his breath. Ridley confessed to rigging the footprint device, mixing the powder, and threading the rope through the joists. But he never claimed authorship. He said, "I was given the plan." And Percival? Too desperate to plan, too frightened of exposure to be creative. I leaned forward. "Then who?" Holmes gave a small smile. "That is precisely what I intend to discover." He swept up his coat and motioned for me to follow. We made our way once again to Southwark, though not to Dalrymple Street this time, but to a modest bookshop nestled near the Borough Market. The painted sign above the door read Aldwych and Sons, antiquarian and legal titles. The bell above the door chimed softly as we entered. The interior was dim, lined wall to wall with tomes, legal digests, and leather-bound ledgers that smelled of age and ash. A woman in her late 40s looked up from behind the counter. She was tall, neat, her hair pinned in a sharp coil, her eyes quick and unreadable. "Miss Aldwych," Holmes said warmly, removing his hat. "Or is it Mrs. now?" The woman smiled thinly. "Still, miss, you must be Mr. Holmes. You knew I would come." She gave the faintest shrug. "I assumed. You're predictable in that way." Holmes chuckled softly and approached the counter. "Then you know what I'm here to ask." She folded her hands. "I had nothing to do with Mrs. Riggs' death." Holmes glanced at me, then back to her. "Not directly, no. But you provided the research, the precedent, the ideas. A study of suggestive death through artificial phenomena. The kind found in old texts, Latin perhaps, acolytes of Mesmer, The Theosophists. I sell books, Mr. Holmes. You advise Percival. Legal assistance, yes, but also intellectual direction. You helped him construct the illusion. She said nothing for a moment. Then, he came to me months ago, said he was being blackmailed by a housekeeper, wanted something dramatic, said she was ruining the family. I warned him not to do anything foolish. But you gave him the blueprint. She hesitated again. He was a client. Holmes took a step closer. You advised on the sealed room arrangement, on how to frame a death as inexplicable. That letter he received, the one Watson and I found unsigned, warning that Edna Rigg knew. The phrasing was not Percival's. It bore your style. I've seen your legal arguments in published journals. You enjoy precision, but you also enjoy theater. You told him to frighten her into silence. She looked down at her hands, suddenly quiet. She was old, she said at last. I didn't think he'd go through with it. But he did, and Ridley made it possible. And you... Holmes tapped the counter, gave it form. I didn't kill her. Number U just taught a man how. There was a long silence. Finally, Miss Aldwych said, "Will you arrest me?" Holmes exhaled through his nose. That's for Gregson to decide, but I suspect he'll have questions, especially once I show him the annotated copy of Mesmeric Mechanisms and Postural Hallucinations I found on your shelf last year at the Royal Society's archive. Your marginalia is difficult to mistake. He tipped his hat and turned to go. Outside, the wind had picked up, scattering bits of paper along the pavement. You knew, I said quietly, before we even left this morning. I suspected, Holmes said. A crime like this has fingerprints too subtle for the eye, but not for the mind. The way Percival spoke of Edna Rigg, like a threat, not a person. That language came from someone else. Miss Aldwych coached him, and as always, it was the smallest detail that revealed the most. I glanced sideways. Which was? The phrase above the eyeline, Holmes said, used both by Percival and Ridley, and by Agnes Bell when recounting Edna's final conversations. A peculiar turn of phrase, wouldn't you agree? Meaning what? Meaning it came from a source. One voice echoed through three mouths. And that source, he said, was Miss Aldwych. We walked on in silence for a while, the air bitter but clean, the noise of the city gradually returning with the new day. I must confess, I said after a time, I never imagined so many layers beneath a single footprint. Holmes gave a thin smile. That's precisely the intention of the footprint, Watson, to draw your eye upward, away from the floor where the truth lies buried. Like every good illusion, it distracts while the real trick happens beneath your nose. And though the case was all but over, and the law would soon catch up to those who had pulled strings behind the curtain, I could not help but feel that we had seen something rare. Not simply murder, nor even fraud, but a performance, a cruel, meticulous fiction brought to life at the cost of a woman's quiet courage. Back at Baker Street, as Holmes poured 2 brandies and the dusk descended like a velvet curtain upon London's rooftops, I found myself reflecting on what he had said. There are no ghosts in London, only men who depend on others believing in them. But not tonight, not anymore. It was a rare thing to see Holmes satisfied, truly satisfied, not merely entertained by the unraveling of a complex case. That evening, with the fire burning low and a soft drizzle tickling the windows, he appeared not merely content but contemplative. He leaned back in his chair, the brandy glass untouched in his hand, his gaze fixed not on me, nor the documents spread across our table, but on the flickering play of firelight. For my part, I felt a curious mixture of triumph and unease. The mechanics of the crime were clear. Percival Gryce had the motive, Ridley built the means. Miss Aldwych provided the conceptual framework, the philosophical skeleton for a murder hidden in suggestion. Each had played their part, deliberately or otherwise. And Mrs. Edna Rigg had died for her loyalty and her silence. And yet, something still nagged at me. "Holmes," I said, "there's one thing I still don't quite understand." He stirred slightly but did not look away from the fire. "Only one." "That may be a record, Watson." I ignored the jab. The timing. If Ridley and Percival intended Mrs. Rigg to die by exposure to the compound, then the setup had to be exact. And if she had gone into the parlor an hour earlier, or not at all, the compound might have dissipated or worse, drawn attention. They relied on her routine. But how could they guarantee she would be there at the precise time? Holmes finally turned to look at me, his expression unreadable. "An excellent question. And the answer is, they didn't merely rely on routine, they controlled it." He rose and retrieved a small notebook from the mantel. I recognized it at once. It was Mrs. Rigg's appointment ledger, taken from her attic quarters. Holmes flipped to the most recent week and handed it to me, a finger tapping the Friday entry. 11:45, lay fire in parlor, dust mantelpiece, sit for mending while it burns down. Her own words, Holmes said, her own pattern. But notice the entry is in a different hand than the others. I narrowed my eyes. It was subtle. Her usual handwriting was crisp, slightly slanted. But this line was marginally rounder, a bit less fluid. "Forged," I said. Holmes nodded. "Inserted. By someone who knew she relied on this ledger for her daily schedule. Someone who could ensure she'd follow it without suspicion." "Percival," I said. "Or Miss Aldwych," Holmes replied. "She had access to documents, likely even personal effects. It's possible she wrote the entry herself, giving precise timing instructions through an innocuous medium." I felt a chill. So they manipulated not just her surroundings, but her behavior. Indeed, suggestion layered upon suggestion, a room prepared for poison, a footprint to deliver the shock, a forged schedule to lure her in. "But there's another layer still," Holmes continued, his voice quieter now. "One I have been hesitant to mention until we were absolutely certain of Ridley's cooperation." He crossed to the writing desk and unlocked the bottom drawer, removing a thin folder sealed with string. "This," he said, "came to me anonymously 3 nights ago." It was left at the door with no note. I opened it slowly. Inside were several grainy photographs, clearly taken with a pocket camera, of the Grice household. The parlor, the attic, and the basement workroom. The angles were careful, intimate. Some had markings on them in pencil, notations of air currents, pressure points, soot patterns. There were calculations too, airflow rates, exposure estimates, ceiling angles. "This was no improvisation," I whispered. "This was a drafted operation." Holmes was nodding grimly. "And you see what that implies, Watson. These photos were taken well before the murder, perhaps weeks before. Someone was documenting the layout meticulously, not just helping the plot, but engineering it." A thought struck me. But if they were taken before the crime, the person who sent these may have had second thoughts. "Or regrets," Holmes said. "Ridley did not send these. His confession made that plain. Miss Aldwych might have, though it's unlikely. She's not the remorseful sort. No, I believe there was a fourth party. Someone operating in the shadows, possibly hired or trusted by Percival, but not privy to the entire plan. A witness? Perhaps even a saboteur. Someone who set the wheels in motion but flinched when they saw how far it would go." He sat down again, rubbing his temples. "There is an intelligence behind all this, Watson, that does not match the known players. Someone with technical knowledge, access to the Grice home, and, most importantly, a conscience too slow to prevent tragedy, but just swift enough to seek resolution." We stared at the photographs again, their edges curling with damp. Whoever had taken them had known what they were looking for. Someone who understood the weight of each device, the meaning behind each setup. It felt intimate, almost protective. "I believe," Holmes said slowly, "that there was an accomplice who tried in the end to warn us. The footprint was a trap, yes, but also a message. They wanted someone to look. And what do we do now?" Holmes drew a long breath. "We wait. The game is not entirely over." True to his word, Holmes posted a small notice the next day in the Times, nestled innocuously among the classifieds. "To the caretaker of the Ghost Theatre, we have read your script. If you regret the third act, come to Curtain Call, Baker Street. No questions, no judgment. We received no visitor the first day, nor the second, but on the third, just after sunset, a soft knock came at the door. Mrs. Hudson answered, and moments later a boy of perhaps 16 stepped inside, hat in hand, hair damp with rain, eyes darting nervously toward Holmes and then to me. He wore a rough coat, clearly second-hand, and his boots were patched with care. Holmes stood slowly. "Your name?" The boy hesitated. "Nolan, sir. Nolan Price. You delivered the photographs." He nodded, swallowing hard. I helped set the rigging, only the ropes and the pulleys. Mr. Ridley paid me, said it was for a show. I believed him. But then I came back a few days later, heard them talking through the door. Ridley and the man with the spectacles, the older one. They were laughing about how the old girl wouldn't know what hit her. His voice cracked slightly. That's when I knew it wasn't a show. You kept the photographs? I took them myself. I was curious, sir. I've always liked traps and levers. I didn't know it would be used to hurt someone. Holmes moved toward him and placed a hand gently on his shoulder. You did right, in the end. You told the truth. The boy's eyes brimmed, but he blinked quickly and nodded. After Mrs. Hudson had taken him to the kitchen for warm food, Holmes stood silent for a long moment by the window. He was the linchpin, he said at last. The one piece left uncounted. A boy with an eye for precision and a heart not yet too dulled for remorse. I looked again at the rain tapping against the glass, at the flickering street lamps beyond. It seems, I said quietly, that even the smallest footstep can leave a mark. Holmes gave a slight smile, and for once he did not correct me. By the time young Nolan Price finished his soup and bread and was safely delivered by Mrs. Hudson into the care of Inspector Gregson for a formal statement, Holmes had returned to the settee with a look that, to anyone else, might have seemed placid. But I had long since learned to read beneath the surface. His fingers tapped rhythmically against his knee. His eyes, though half-lidded, were fixed in abstraction. He was, in his way, pursuing the final thread still unspooled from the complex tapestry of the case. I sat quietly for a time, then spoke with hesitation. Holmes, does the boy's involvement change your conclusion? He glanced at me sidelong. It completes it, or rather, it completes the shape of the story, its symmetry. Symmetry? Yes. Consider. A wealthy man, Percival Gryce, embroiled in fraud, seeks to silence a woman whose honesty could unravel his schemes. He enlists a magician, Ridley, for the stagecraft, and a legal scholar, Miss Aldwych, for the conceptual framework. Together they build a murder disguised as a haunting, but they rely, as these men so often do, on the invisible class, the boys and girls they never see, only use. He stood now, hands clasped behind his back, and began to pace. It was Nolan who provided the last piece. He built the rigging Ridley was too clumsy to manage. He observed without being seen. He heard what was not meant for his ears. And when the plan turned from deception to death, he stepped back into the story. Not for gain, not for pride, but because his conscience insisted. I considered that. You think his intervention was accidental? Not in the least. It was instinctual. He saw injustice and, though afraid, did what none of the adults involved dared. He acted. A photograph here, a note dropped there. quiet efforts, the foundation upon which the truth was eventually built. Holmes resumed his seat, his eyes unfocusing once again in thought. "You said earlier," I ventured, "that the case had a fourth architect, that someone had designed the illusion but then tried to unravel it from within. Now you believe that was Nolan?" "In part. But no," Holmes said. "Nolan was a tool of the design, not the designer. Someone else shaped the broader vision, someone who used Ridley's ego, Percival's desperation, and Miss Aldwich's cold intellect to give form to fear. That individual may never be identified, but their signature lies in the precision, the methodical construction, not of murder, but of doubt." He paused. "Consider the footprint, Watson. Why a single print? Why not a trail? Why bare? Why inverted? Not just because it defies reason, but because it invites questions. It's a symbol of contradiction, impossible to ignore and yet devoid of literal meaning. A challenge, not a clue." "So it was never meant to fool Scotland Yard," I said slowly. "It was meant to distract us, you, for just long enough." Holmes nodded, and nearly succeeded, if not for the imperfections: Ridley's trembling hands, Percival's greed, Miss Aldwich's half measures, and Nolan, our unseen witness. There was a knock at the door, sharp and officious. Mrs. Hudson ushered in Inspector Gregson, who bore a heavy satchel under one arm and a rain-damp coat draped over the other. "Evening, Mr. Holmes, Doctor," he said, nodding. "Thought you'd want to see this first." He placed the satchel on the table and extracted from it several files, each marked with the Scotland Yard seal. "Ridley has made a full confession," Gregson said. "Laid out every detail, dates, locations, who paid him and when. Confirmed Young, Nolan's role, though he insisted the boy knew nothing at the time." "And Percival?" Holmes asked. "Still holding fast to the notion that he never intended death. Claims he only wanted to frighten Mrs. Rigg into retirement. But the documents found in the strongbox disprove that, along with the forged schedule in her handwriting. Your observations were spot on." Holmes waved that aside. "And Aldwich?" Gregson grimaced. "Less cooperative. Says her legal advice was purely hypothetical. She admits to suggesting the use of symbolic trauma, but claims no knowledge of the poison, the apparatus, or the date of the incident." Holmes tapped the table softly. "She will, no doubt, wrap herself in the parchment of professional ethics. But the line between theorist and instigator is thin, and in this case I believe she crossed it." Gregson nodded. "We'll let the courts decide." He hesitated, then added, "There is something else. Found during the second sweep of Ridley's lodgings. A journal." He handed it to Holmes. I leaned over his shoulder as he opened it. Each page was covered in dense, spidery writing. Mechanical sketches, timing sequences, lists of materials. And there, tucked near the end, was a short passage that caught my breath. She didn't scream. That was the worst part. I waited for the scream, for the gasp. But she just looked up, and her face was calm. I wanted her to be frightened. That was the point. Not death. Just a story she would carry to the grave. But I misjudged the dose, or she was frailer than she looked. Ridley's own words. A confession not of intent, but of failure. Holmes closed the journal softly. He thought he was writing fiction, he said. But the thing about illusions, Watson, is that they are only safe in the theater. Apply them to the real world, and they unravel. They turn back into cruelty. Gregson stayed a while longer, making notes and thanking Holmes for his assistance. When he finally departed, the house seemed to sigh with relief. I poured myself a drink and offered Holmes one, which he accepted without a word. For a time we sat in companionable silence. Then I asked, "What will become of Nolan?" "He will be offered protection," Holmes replied. "His statement will be pivotal, and Gregson, to his credit, already sees the importance of shielding him from scandal." I nodded, then hesitated. Do you think he'll be all right? Holmes looked into his glass. He has seen the face of evil, not in horror stories, but in drawing rooms and contracts. That leaves a mark. But he chose courage. That is its own form of healing. A long moment passed. Holmes glanced up and added, almost as an afterthought, "And I intend to see him properly employed. The boy has a keen eye for structure, and a steady enough hand once he has purpose. There's a man I know at the telegraph office who owes me a favor." I smiled, and for the first time since the case began, I felt the knot of tension ease. The storm that had hovered over the Grice household had finally passed. The shadows of illusion, once cast so convincingly, had been chased back by fact. There would be no more footsteps on the ceiling, no more poisoned fires, no more carefully orchestrated ghosts. Only the quiet truth, laid bare by Holmes's unrelenting logic and the reluctant courage of a forgotten boy. And as the fire in the grate burned down to embers, and the city slipped into its midnight hush, Holmes lit his pipe and said almost to himself, "It is a rare thing, Watson, to see justice walk quietly through the back door, but I find I prefer it that way." It was several days before I could bring myself to put the entire account to paper. Even as the events settled into place, the arrest of Percival Grice, the confessions from Ridley and Miss Aldwych, young Nolan's reluctant emergence as the final, unseen piece in the mechanism, I found myself caught by a peculiar stillness. There had been cases before this one, of course, and many would come after. But this, I felt, had passed through a different corridor of human cruelty, one where death had been engineered not for gain alone, but to wield fear as a tool. And for Holmes, that was an affront too precise to ignore. That morning, I found Holmes back at his usual place by the window, reading a slim monograph on the ancient uses of mirrored surfaces in Persian architecture. He had the peculiar look he always bore after the resolution of a particularly intense investigation. Restless, faintly amused, and for all his protestations, perhaps a little disappointed that the game had come to an end. I set my teacup down with a small clink and cleared my throat. "There's something I haven't yet asked, Holmes." He turned a page slowly. "Is it the part where you tell me I ought to rest, or perhaps take up a holiday in Bath?" "No," I said. "It's about Edna Rigg." Holmes didn't look up. "I can't stop thinking about her," I continued. "She knew, didn't she? Long before we did. She saw the threads being drawn around her, the falsified schedule, the strange noise in the attic, the letter from Leonard. She knew it was coming." Holmes exhaled. "Yes, but she didn't run." "No," he said. "She chose not to." The simple weight of that truth settled between us. She had stayed, had gone about her duties, laid the fire, mended a seam in silence, and stepped into the parlour at the appointed hour, knowing, perhaps not consciously, but viscerally, that something waited for her there. Not a ghost, not a spectre, but a trap dressed in the clothing of theatre, and she had faced it. Holmes folded the monograph closed and turned toward me. "She was not a martyr," he said, "nor a fool. She was a realist, a servant her whole life, discreet, perceptive, and accustomed to existing on the edge of powerful men's confidences. But she knew Leonard was in danger. She understood that her testimony, written or otherwise, might someday serve as the only proof he had. That strongbox was her legacy. She gave her life for it," I murmured. "No," Holmes said sharply. "She didn't give it. It was taken. Don't confuse dignity with sacrifice. She resisted, Watson, in her way. She left a trail. The forgery in her own ledger, once spotted, helped break the case. The footprint was a message to her, but she left one in return." I looked at him. "The schedule?" "Precisely. Forged, yes, but unburned. She didn't destroy it. She didn't strike it out. She let it sit on the page in that subtle, hesitant handwriting. as if she wanted someone, someday, to compare it to the rest. It was her way of saying, "Look again." I felt something stir behind my ribs. The simplest resistance, I thought, can outlast the most complex cruelty. Holmes stood and moved toward the bureau, pulling from it a sealed envelope. "There is one final matter," he said. "It arrived this morning." He handed it to me. The seal was unmarked. Inside was a single folded note, written in a surprisingly elegant hand. "I do not ask for forgiveness. That time has passed. But I am not unaware of what I have wrought. A door opened by my design led to her death, and I will carry that knowledge for the rest of my days. I do not expect you to believe this absolves me, but I wish to leave London, and this life. Please do not follow. A." I looked up. "Aldwych." Holmes nodded. "Vanished overnight. Her lodgings vacated. Her name removed from the legal directory. I imagine she left with the dawn train to somewhere obscure." "You're letting her go?" He tilted his head. "Would you have her hanged?" "For what? A whispered suggestion? A footnote passed under the table of law? Her guilt is real, but it is buried beneath layers the law has no appetite to excavate. Let her live with what she's done." It was unlike Holmes to speak in such terms. He was not sentimental, but in his tone I heard something deeper than mercy, perhaps a recognition that not every crime ends with the clang of a prison door. Some sentences are quieter and longer. The weeks that followed passed in relative calm. The newspapers spoke little of the Gryce affair. The trial, once it began, was swift. Percival Gryce was convicted of conspiracy, fraud, and accessory to manslaughter. Ridley, with the full weight of his confession, received a reduced sentence in exchange for cooperation. Young Nolan was never named in public records. At Holmes's recommendation, and perhaps with subtle pressure from certain parties, he was granted an apprenticeship in engineering, far from the city and its shadows. As for the house on Dalrymple Street, it was sold quietly. Stripped of the illusion, it became just another quiet London. Address, the footprint on the ceiling, was painted over by the new tenant without remark. And yet, I remember it clearly still. Not as a mark of fear, but of defiance. On a final foggy evening, some weeks after the trial, I found Holmes once more at the window, gazing out at the thinning mist. He had declined all new cases, at least temporarily, and taken to working on a study of illusion and architecture in medieval cathedrals. But I knew his thoughts remained, in part, with the woman whose courage had not required applause. "I suppose," I said, settling into the chair opposite him, "that this one will stay with us." Holmes gave a faint smile. "There are cases that stretch the mind, Watson, and those that stretch the soul. This was both." He tapped the glass lightly with a fingertip, then added, "And that's as it should be. We are, after all, in the business of light, not only of uncovering facts, but of dispelling shadows." He stood, reached for the poker, and stirred the fire back to life. The warmth glowed steadily, crackling, steady in the hearth, as the chill of London deepened beyond the windows. "The world," Holmes said, "is not short on cleverness, Watson, but it is terribly short on clarity. That is what we offer. That is what we owe." And I nodded, for I could think of nothing better to say. It was a fortnight later, as the first signs of spring edged their way into London, small green tips braving the soot-streaked stone of garden walls, that the final thread came loose. Not with drama, nor with an urgent knock at the door, but through a letter. I found it tucked among the post one morning, unassuming, bearing no return address. Holmes took it with a flick of his fingers and opened it at once, reading silently, the flicker of a smile, so rare, so precise, ghosting across his features. "Well," he murmured, "our phantom steps one last time." He passed it to me, and I read, "Mr. Holmes, you once said fear is a structure, and I was foolish enough to believe I could live in its architecture without it collapsing on me. I believed intellect protected me. That suggestion was not action, but Mrs. Rigg reminded me what true resistance looks like. I offered knowledge and pretended it came without weight. She bore that weight, and I watched her die for it. I have no illusions left, only gratitude for your unwillingness to be distracted by spectacle and for your protection of the boy. He deserved better than the shadows we cast around him. I am leaving England. Perhaps that is cowardice, perhaps exile. Either way, it is earned. You once said no footprint should appear where no foot has walked. Perhaps I walked farther than I meant to. A. I folded the letter carefully and looked to Holmes, who had already resumed his post at the mantelpiece, watching the fire. She sees it now, I said. Yes, Holmes replied. She does. There was no warrant for Miss Aldwych, no chase, no dramatic confrontation at a railway station. And Holmes made no effort to pursue her, nor to notify the yard. Her guilt had not disappeared, but it had changed. It had grown roots, taken hold, transformed from something theoretical into something weighty, permanent. That, Holmes believed, would do more than prison ever could. As the days passed and the case slipped from public memory, it lingered with us in quiet ways. Holmes became, for a time, unusually contemplative, spending long hours among his monographs and only occasionally emerging to dissect the day's newspaper with that scalpel-sharp tongue of his. One afternoon, I asked him whether he thought justice had truly been served. Holmes set down his cup and looked at me, not with certainty, but with clarity. Justice, Watson, is rarely a clean verdict. It's more often a balancing of debts. Percival paid with reputation and liberty. Ridley paid with truth. Aldwych. She pays in silence, which may yet be the harshest toll. And young Nolan, I hope, will be repaid by the world in time. And Mrs. Rigg? She left the truth behind, Holmes said, not as testimony, but as proof. And that, ultimately, is what pulled the whole illusion apart. I said nothing more. There was nothing more to say. The case had begun with the impossible, a footprint on a ceiling in a sealed room. It had led us through forged documents, silent accomplices, and staged terror, until the most theatrical clue revealed the most human of truths. That fear is a powerful weapon, but so too is quiet resolve. Some weeks later, on one of our walks through the less fashionable ends of the city, we passed Dalrymple Street. Number 13 had been freshly repainted. The curtains were different. A new name on the gate. Holmes slowed as we passed, just for a moment. "No more ghosts," he said softly. And then he turned from the house and walked on, his long coat trailing behind him in the spring breeze, already several steps ahead, as always. And I, as always, followed.